This is Compendium, a podcast about communication and communication research. This podcast is produced in conjunction with the Department of Communication at the University of Connecticut. Here now are the hosts of Compendium, Steve Stefano and Christine Gilbert.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to a new episode of Compendium. Today's topic is social media and specifically how it impacts our everyday lives, and our guest is a resident social media expert.
Dr. Ann Oeldorf-Hirsch is an assistant professor here in the Department of Communication. She studies human-computer interactions, broadly focusing on how we process new information, civic engagement, and well-being.
And we look forward to her interview. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and check out our conversation with Ann Oeldorf-Hirsch. Our guest today is a social media and new technology researcher and assistant professor in the Department of Communication. Please welcome Dr. Ann Oeldorf-Hirsch.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we're going to start with a few basic background questions. First and foremost, where were you born?
I was born in a suburb of Stuttgart in Germany.
Okay.
And then I moved to the U.S. when I was 5 and grew up in Oregon. So most of my life is in Oregon.
All right. Pacific Northwest.
That's right. Corner to corner.
Uh-huh. So when was the first moment in school that you were experiencing some form of education and said, you know, I think I'm interested in this communication thing?
Very late. I was already pursuing a PhD in industrial organizational psychology.
Ooh.
And at the time, I was really interested in that in undergrad, so I decided to take that into graduate school. Mm-hmm. And then I just sort of lost it just didn't fit for me anymore. So I started honestly looking around, like, what else is there out here? I was at Penn State at the time, and I discovered they had a whole college of communication there and found people researching basically the psychological effects of media. So that was kind of the communication tie to me. Like, it sounds like a weird shift from IO psych to communication, but for me it was just the psychology of interacting with people to the psychology of people interacting with media or with each other through media.
I'm personally, I don't see that much of a difference when you start to think about all the processes at hand, but I know some people silo both of those things very distinctly. So was there a point in this exploration, or maybe because it was a PhD program, it was pretty clear that you said, I'm committed to this. This is the field I want to go into. This is what I want to do. Was there a point where the light bulb went off and it wasn't just, communication, but also, no, this is it right here?
Yeah, and for me, it was, I think the underlying tie to both of those fields was research. Mm-hmm. And so, like I said, I started, over in psychology, and I was really interested in doing research. I've always been fascinated by people and their interactions. And so that was the tie that kind of brought me over. And so I did kind of recommit to now the content's different, but I still, whatever it is that I want to do, it's research people. And I didn't know exactly what I was going to do with a PhD in comm at that point, to be honest. But I knew I wanted to do research.
So we know that it sounds like you went to Penn State for your PhD, and you got there through a path that wasn't necessarily communication, but where did you do your undergrad or your master's as well?
I actually don't have a master's, so that's an interesting effect of going the way I did. But I did my undergrad at Portland State University, so I have a BA in psychology from there.
Okay, great. So we talked a little bit about that transition. Can you tell us more in depth about, so you kind of fell in love with psychology and the application of it, and that moment in graduate school, what did that feel like when you realized that something was missing, or how did you, can you tell us a little bit about what that felt like to navigate and then to find a new home?
Mm-hmm. I mean, at the time it was terrifying, right? Because I had just moved from Oregon to Pennsylvania to come to Penn State for this top IO Psych program, and I had this nagging feeling that I'm like, I don't know if this is right, but you try to ignore it. You go, no, it's just hard right now. There's just a lot going on. It'll be easier after the semester, right? So it was really terrifying to kind of admit that. And the thing was, I couldn't just transfer. I had to reapply because it was a different college. It's a PhD. It's a whole different thing. So I actually started sneaking over to comm classes, and I would sit in on some of them and be like, is this what I want to do? Is this interesting? Is this right? And so I would kind of go over there between my regular classes, and then I applied to their program, and then I finally had to go back to my original program and say, hey, I've applied again to graduate school for this other program. I'm going to be leaving. So it was terrifying at the time. It was really hard to make all those decisions.
So I love the idea of you sneaking into communication classes. I'm assuming they were small. So they probably knew there was some outsider.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, 8 people, dozen people, kind of like what we have here. Yeah.
This Anne woman keeps coming back.
But she tiptoes really quietly. They don't notice her.
So I almost wonder, to what extent did you? So I know that your advisor, who you worked with, Sundar, is huge in the field. So did you find him early, or was that more of a progression to kind of his lab and his research? Was he early into the moment of transition for you?
He was one of the first people I met with. So it was him and Mary Beth Oliver, who's really big in media effects research, more outside of technology, but kind of more broadly in entertainment space. So I met with the two of them. His class was one of the ones I sat in on that really I thought, oh my gosh, you can study this? You can study how people interact with the internet? This is amazing. It wasn't really social media at the time even. So yeah, he was early on. Yeah.
So I think this is a good transition to move into a little bit about your research. So in this department, we have a lot of people doing a lot of things, and I would safely say that we regard you as our social media guru.
Thank you.
You've done a lot of fascinating research, and one thing that we have talked about in COM 1000, but that I'd like you to expand on because you did this work and it's so interesting, was on terms and conditions. So specifically dealing with people's attention or lack thereof towards terms and conditions.
Right.
Could you maybe share a little bit about this research and while we're at it, make sure you mention firstborn children?
That's right, yes. So this is research that I did with, and we continue to do, we just did another round with an older population, with Jonathan Obar. He's a professor up at York University in Toronto, Canada. He and I actually went to graduate school together, so that's how we know each other. And he approached me with this project because he comes from a very law, policy, ethics kind of space, and he knew me as sort of the experimentalist, more, social science in that sense. So he wanted to do the study about, we all kind of know we don't pay attention to terms of service, but can we give some weight to this? Like, can we give numbers to this to say, this is how many people really didn't pay attention. And so, the kicker was that we had put into this fake terms and service that by signing up, you agree to give up your firstborn child. And nearly everybody agreed to that because presumably they hadn't read it. So very few people, only a handful of people had noticed it at all. So that's the basic premise of that research.
It continues to break Christine every time we talk about the firstborn child. So as she laughs along, I want to ask, do you think we read anything anymore? Do you think people actually read anymore? We talk about the difference in in-depth comprehension and understanding, but in a way, you could look at this as just its terms and conditions and we scroll through it, but it is kind of scary. Mm-hmm. I think about, you go to buy a home and they give you a bunch of paperwork and they say sign here, here, and here, and immediately everybody goes, oh, okay. And there's a lot of people and a lot of legal experts around us going, make sure you read carefully. That's a contract with a lot of different things in our lives, but also content that we consume on the internet. And it concerns me that maybe we just don't read anything anymore. What do you think about that?
Yes and no. I think we don't read in depth very much. I don't know if it's only because of internet, social media, or if we've kind of always done that. And these platforms, I think, make that easier and they encourage that. There was a study done a while ago where they looked at headlines that had been shared or links that had been shared on social media, and they found that 60% of them had never been clicked before they were shared. So people just see a headline and share it. I don't know that that's different than maybe how we would have tried to process information before, because we're always looking for shortcuts. We always want to say what's the least amount of kind of cognitive attention I can give this information and still gain something from it. And so I think social media or just kind of digital technology makes that easier and makes that more acceptable in different ways.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
So related to kind of the impacts of social media as well, we know in the department that you're an avid runner and that. I think you have a poster on your door that says trails were the first social network, something along those lines. And you've done some research about M-Health or this idea of posting and tracking your exercises and your calories. Is there kind of broadly, what are some of the things that you found? Is sharing your workout actually helpful? Do we have any data to suggest that is a trend? If I want to start running, should I be posting my half-mile jogs at a 12-mile pace, or is that actually not beneficial?
Yeah, so we did just one study so far looking at, it was survey research. We'd love to follow up on this with actual experiments where we make people post and see what happens. But we did find that sharing was helpful in terms of at least your perceived health. as long as you felt like you got certain types of support for it and the right amount of feedback. So there was this interesting effect when people got too much feedback, they actually, the effects were a little bit more negative. And we think some of that's tied to different types of support that we measured. So something like network support was really useful, because if you felt like you had a network supporting you, that makes sense, right? Like, oh, everybody's supporting me in this run or this endeavor or this health endeavor. And something like informational support was not considered as helpful, because you can imagine, you say like, well, I just posted this 5-mile run that I did, and someone goes, oh, great, well, there's a 10K you could do later, So sometimes
actually.
Yeah. So information is maybe not always the best support. So it depends on the types of support, the type of feedback. We didn't measure this, but certainly also your intentions, right? What are you seeking from what you're posting would certainly make a difference.
So what's interesting, you mentioned that, and maybe an excess amount of feedback can be detrimental or problematic. Do you find that with the social media culture that has developed, that by and large people are exhausted?
It seems like it. This is not something I've studied explicitly, but even just talking in our classes with my students, because I teach a social media class, and even just media effects, there does be, that's a sentence.
It is on social media.
It does be. There does seem to be this kind of general, like, we're just sort of worn out. There's a tension. I want my phone on me. I want to see what's going on. But so many students tell me that they're kind of relieved sometimes when they forget their phone or their battery dies. Like, they're anxious, but they're also like, oh, I don't have to check in. I have an excuse for why I can't be contacted right now, or why I can't respond to this, or I can't look at this.
It's like a get out of jail free card for all those social obligations and,
right.
and constant monitoring that needs to be done. I find that consistently interesting across a lot of work I do. And I even see the same thing with my students, so I do a lot of production work, and so I'm working with students in creating media, and so there's feedback processes within that, and they know they're going to get audience feedback. It's a little different than the social media thing, but I even see that there's a fine point of, at some point my feedback is so detailed they just get completely overwhelmed, and at other times the feedback maybe is a little ambiguous and they come craving more. So it is interesting to think about just how much information we're consuming about every aspect of our lives, whether it's our professional, our educational, our personal, our social, our romantic, and how all that information can just kind of sweep us up. And I think that over the next 15 or 20 years, one thing that me, as someone on the sidelines watching great social media researchers like you do your work, is interested in seeing is how we maybe better come to grips with that. Because the early interpersonal research didn't quite capture maybe all the nuances that we see now in interpersonal communication. We're better able to explicate more complex processes and understand sort of what makes us tick. And I feel like we're in the infancy of that with social media. So it makes me wonder, from your perspective, do you think there's maybe some larger development coming where we kind of put some of this together and figure it out, or is it because the technology is so adaptive and so changing over time that maybe things are going to continue to meander and we're just going to try and stay up to date with it?
Oh, that's like the existential question of social media. No, I think that's fascinating. I think we are learning to adapt to it. We were just talking in my media effects class yesterday about even just the language of texting, how we're all kind of starting to learn what texting conventions mean. I mean, even things like where you put the period and where you put the line breaks and what those things connote. And so I think we are learning both the language of how these things work, and I think we're still working on how to adapt sort of the effects. That's actually an area that I'm really interested in that I haven't pursued too much, is how aware are we even of kind of what we're doing and what those effects are, and how do we understand how to maybe step in and sort of stop ourselves and go, I don't feel great when I sit on this site for this long. What's something else I can do? So I think we're still learning that piece of it. Like, I think we're getting the language down, but not necessarily the kind of adaptation to that.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be complicated and frightful. And so something that the three of us recently participated in an event tied to this topic, but you've done a lot of work in the Connecticut community related to science communication. So could you talk a little bit more about your work with the Science Center in Hartford and why you do this kind of research and what we'll call outreach as well, to try and connect people to the notion that, hey, it's not just science that happens over here. Like, we all need to embrace it.
Yeah, so the Science Center is something that's kind of built over time. I got connected through somebody I knew who worked there, like one of those things, like, oh, you might be good for this event that they're looking for someone for. And at first I ended up giving a talk at the Hartford Public Library, actually, on just social media, kind of to a public audience about, like, what kind of information does social media collect? What do you do with it? What are the effects on you? Things like that. And so I've kind of developed a relationship with them over time, doing a little bit more and more with them. And so my social media class, I worked to convert it to a service learning course, which is an officially designated university type of course. So it actually shows up on the transcript that they did this course that has this community partner aspect to it. And so I decided to reach out to the Science Center and say, do you want to be our community partner? Like, do you have some kind of need that, you know, having my students work on for you in terms of social media would be useful? And they said, yes, that would be absolutely exciting. They're really interested in getting more of a young adult audience into the center, thinking about new ways to use social media. And so most of my work with them has actually been through my social media class. The students did analysis of their social media. They've developed content. So the Science Center is actually running some of our students' content right now, which is awesome to see.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So it's so fun because I see a post come up on my Instagram and I go, wait a second, one of my student groups made that. And so they're working on pulling in the metrics right now and kind of, you know, finalizing all of that. But so most of that has been through the class. Yeah.
So is the community focus something that has always kind of been important to you? I'd love to hear more about why to you as a researcher. I think it's unfortunately uncommon that people really want to make sure that people understand or they want to partner. So for you, how was that journey? What does that look like?
I think, honestly, that was kind of triggered in my undergrad. So Portland State is right downtown Portland. They're an urban university, and so they actually have as part of their design and their mission that they have to work with the city. So they have like their motto, I guess, is let knowledge serve the city. And so as part of your coursework there, eventually you do have to do some work with community partners. So everyone does a senior capstone, which is kind of like a service learning course where you have to actually partner up with a community organization as part of the class. And so I think that was just ingrained in me, seeing the university be right downtown, doing so much work with the city, that connection is really important to me. You know, same with UConn, we're this giant university in the state. I don't know how we don't connect to the state and the community and think about our impacts here.
I think it's such a wonderful resource to have that connection, and you never know what benefits that may draw in the future for UConn or for the Hartford Science Center as well. So making a little bit of a transition, I'd like to talk about your Twitter feed.
Okay.
Don't panic. I know that I feel like I say Twitter feed and everyone's like, oh God, what did I post? So one of the things I noticed going through in preparation for the interview is that you share a lot of research done by women in science, and that seems to be something that's very important to you. And so I mean, as a woman, hopefully, you know, coming into the science world, you're a wonderful role model to have as someone who supports other women in research, and that this, you know, social science is a place for women always. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, has that always been something that you've kind of been conscious of? I think it's easy to maybe forget about, you know, all the people before us or after us, and you seem to make a really concentrated effort to pull people with you.
Well, thank you. I don't know that that's been explicit. I don't think I sat down one day and said, like, all right, I'm going to do this. I think it's just been the conversation kind of growing around us culturally. And so I feel aware of that in that sense, that who am I citing? Because I love to post about other people's research that comes out. And I like to notice, you know, who is it that I'm talking about? Who am I including? So I didn't really set out with that mission. I think it's just grown because our conversation has grown in terms of who are we representing in science generally. So whether it's women, people of color, other groups that maybe don't always get the dominant voice.
And I think it's a wonderful connection, kind of reflection of your work and making sure that outside the world of academia and on your own personal Twitter, you're still trying to push that mission of community and supporting other researchers. So I think that's very clear whether it was explicit or not, which is interesting.
So we're winding down, and we've got a couple of interesting questions that we pretty much give to everybody, but that we still want to give to you too. If you had, we have a lot of lectures in our Introduction to Communication course. It's a buffet. And if you had one 50-minute lecture to cover anything you wanted in this field, anything that you'd like to reach essentially a brand new audience of communication scholars or potential communication scholars, what would you lecture about and why?
I think I would combine sort of my worlds of media effects and social media, and I would probably give a lecture on what are some of the ways that social media use influence us, and what are the ways that we can not necessarily counteract, not that they're all negative, but maybe counteract the potentially negative influences and sort of enhance the positive influences. So kind of an effects, literacy, you know, mindfulness, intention sort of package of social media.
I think that would be great because I was saying this to somebody the other day. Every semester we teach our social media lecture towards the end of the term, and every semester I look at it and I have to resituate how relevant is it, how useful is this information. Do these theories that we used to use to explain this part of it, where we connect social media to CMC in general and whatnot, does it still connect as well? Do people still relate as well? Is this example that was funny 2 years ago even remotely humorous now for a variety of reasons? Are the memes that were relevant before relevant at all? And social media is just so rapidly changing that I think the perspective that you just put out there is probably the best lens with which to teach it in such a small package. Of just think about it in the context of our lives and how it's impacting us and how we're relating to it. Because when you try and teach it as content, it gets a little tricky.
The struggle is real on that one. That's my media effects class. It's a constant comparison of like, well, we had this theory, does it hold up? Or we had this theory about content, does that make sense here? Right? So we're constantly balancing that.
Yeah, definitely.
So the last question, and I think your story is such a good reflection of people come to communication at all points in their career. Some people start off right off the gates, and I almost think this is uncommon, where they know communication is exactly what they want to do. So I think your story is a really good example of you can make it all the way to a prestigious PhD program and go, I should probably listen to my gut and I should probably do what it is that my heart's telling me to do. So as a final question, do you have one piece of advice for our students about communication or college in general, just something that's been true to you throughout your whole journey, your academic journey?
I think I want to say you have time. Like, there's no hurry. There's no deadline on these things. My story meanders even more. I actually started as a music major in undergrad, and then went briefly to computer engineering before I went to psychology. So I changed my mind a lot. I transferred schools in undergrad. I did all kinds of things. So it feels really terrifying in the moment to be like, oh my gosh, I got to hurry. I got to get done. It's delaying me. I'm going to be here another year. I'm going to be here. I'm going to have to start over on something. The time will pass anyway. And so I think just using the time to really figure out what you want, and not feeling like there's a deadline to it and like you have to hurry and you have to rush yourself through something.
I love that. Thank you. That's wonderful. So that's it for us. I want to thank my co-host, Dr. Steve Stefano and Dr. Ann Oeldorf-Hirsch, for coming in to talking with us. And the audience, thank you for listening.
Thank you.
The views expressed in this podcast are those of the hosts and their guests. They do not reflect the views of the University of Connecticut or the UConn Department of Communication.